I would like to call up to the stage Dov Zakheim, Vice Chairman of FPRI and former Undersecretary of Defense, our guest of honor, Kana Makiya, and Trudy Rubin, our conversationalist for the night. Dov will present the award to Kana Makiya. This is the award.
First I do the intros, don't I? Yeah. Well, there was one person that Al overlooked when he was doing all the thank yous. That was Alan Luxembourg. He's done a phenomenal job. And he's made FPRI, something else he didn't tell you, into the best small think tank in America, which is pretty good. Now, I'm not going to review my friend Kana Makiya's bio. You can read it on page 5. So I want to give you just some personal thoughts about this courageous individual. Can you imagine writing a book about Saddam Hussein when Saddam was alive? Criticizing him, and the fact that Kana is still here is a miracle in and of itself, considering the cruelty, the butchery that became synonymous with Saddam Hussein. Kana was a member of the Iraqi National Council, which was kind of their set-up government in exile before we went into Iraq. But his focus was on human rights. Here's a Shia Muslim from Iraq who has spent decades teaching in a Jewish university. How many people can even imagine something like that? And what does it tell you about his vision of humanity, of how people can work together, live together, make each other better? He's written a novel called The Rope. What's it, in the third now? The third publication, third-ish reissuance? Oh, yes. In Iraq. It's about not how we Americans blew it, although we Americans blew it, but how the Iraqis blew it. How the very kinds of hatred that propelled Saddam to do the cruelties that he did seems to have somehow been perpetuated. And it's actually about a man who's the father of someone I know and Kana knows, who was murdered by a man called Muqtada al-Sadr, whose father was murdered. Well, Muqtada didn't do it, his people did it. And his father was murdered by Saddam Hussein's people. The cycle of violence. And Kana doesn't just write novels. He started out actually as an architect. He's a man of many parts. But I'm a trustee of the American University of Iraq in Kurdistan in Sulaymaniyah. One of the founding trustees was Kana Makiya. And the whole idea of the university, Kanan's idea, was that it shouldn't just be for Kurds. It should be for Shia, it should be for Sunni, it should be for men, it should be for women. A bright spot in such a dark part right now. That tells you about this man. And so it's absolutely fitting that he get the Benjamin Franklin Award. He's a patriot. He's a he's an architect. He's a statesman. He's a writer. And the award is kind of neat. It's a 1798 publication of the life and works of Benjamin Franklin. And I know you write a lot, but I hope you'll read this one. The person who's going to be up on the stage with him is Trudy Rubin. Anybody who reads the Philadelphia Inquirer and has not heard of Trudy Rubin probably doesn't read the Philadelphia Inquirer. I've known Trudy a long time as well. Trudy is one of the top journalists in this country. She's a Middle East expert. She's a South Asia expert. She has served in the Middle East. She worked for The Economist. She's a Smithy, right? Smith graduate. And then she went to London School of Economics, where I spent a year as well. And she got a degree, I didn't. And so you're really in for a treat tonight. A top journalist interviewing one of the great humanitarians in this country and in the world. So enjoy. Thank you. There you go, my man.
Well, it's a great honor and a pleasure not just to be here, but to be talking to Kana Makiya, because Kana was really my introduction to Iraq. Long ago in 1990, although I had been a Middle East correspondent, I had not actually been to Iraq before then. The Iran-Iraq war was going on. And through Kana, I met a huge variety of Shiite opposition activists in exile, and one thing after another led me to Sayad Majeed al-Houthi, the cleric whose murder is at the center of this book. I'd like to say a word both about Kana and about Sayad Majeed before I get into a conversation and discussion with Kana. First of all, Kana had the courage to do something that simply rarely happens in the region. He went somewhere where most Arab intellectuals don't go, which is to examine the responsibility that Arabs have for their plight and not just look at what the West has done, or allegedly has done, actually and allegedly, to the Arab world. He wrote about the butchery of Saddam, as Dove said, when other people were turning a blind eye, especially to the massacre of Kurds, which simply never got brought up by Arab intellectuals, or very, very rarely, even though hundreds of thousands of Kurds were killed. And in the rope, Kana says about the book, it's a book about Arab character in politics as well as ideas. And I think that that is such an important direction in which he has gone intellectually that has set a marker in writing about the Arab world. Now, in case you haven't read The Rope, and you really should, don't get put off by the names of all the clerics. There's more than one Sutter, there's more than one Hui. Focus on the essential point, and the essential point is just absolutely crucial to understanding the region. It's actually a very Shakespearean story. It is built around the cover-up of a murder of this wonderful cleric whom I came to know, who was in his early 40s, I believe, when he was killed, maybe a little bit older. But the reason that he was killed, he chose to go back to Iraq. He had escaped from Iraq in 1991 after the first Gulf War, when you remember President Bush told the Iraqis to rise up and then let the Shiites be slaughtered. He managed to get out. His father at the time was the Grand Ayatollah Hui, the senior-most cleric in the Shiite cleric in the world, much more senior than Ayatollah Khomeini, and a quietist who believed in separation of mosque and state and the role of the clerics and the politicians. Ayatollah Hui died in 1992, and his successor and mentee, Ayatollah Sistani, is still the Grand Ayatollah in Iraq. Sayad Majeed escaped, went to London, and he believed that he could go back and play as a go-between role between the Americans and the clergy in Najaf. And that would help the Americans understand what they should do and how they should behave in the region. And instead, what happened, he was airlifted in by the CIA, flown in. I happened to talk to him by satellite phone when he was at a military base outside of Najaf. I was going to meet him in Najaf and do an interview. By the time I got there, he was murdered. He was murdered by Muqtada al-Sadr. Their families had been rivals. And Muqtada did not want any competition and has played a murderous role in the country then and ever since. The essence of this book is the fight within the Iraqi house, the fight within the Shiite house, and a look at how a great opportunity was wasted. and a great man, Sayad Majeed, was killed, symbolizing this immense waste. So with that, as I say, I urge you to read the book because I think it will help you understand a lot of the dynamics that are going on in Iraq today and a lot of the confusion and internecine killing and rivalry that is going on in the region. As Kana has written, Iraq was the dress rehearsal for what befell an entire region. So let me start, having paid my respects to Sayad Majeed, a story that still makes me very sad when I remember it. Tell us a little bit more about what made you want to write this book and why you wrote a separate edition in Arabic.
They came out simultaneously, the Arabic edition and the English edition. And it's a sad story. You've indicated the lineaments of the story. But the silver lining in this bad story is that it's a runaway bestseller inside Iraq among Shiites, which I think is a sign of hope. But you put your finger on it when you use the word an opportunity that was wasted. That's what the book, that's what is the inner motivation that drove the making of the book. The feeling that here is a population that stood to gain the most from this war, that knew that it was being, not en masse, but its elite, knew that it was being intentionally empowered by the United States, by its war, by the overthrow of the tyrant. It is a population that had been grotesquely victimized, as you pointed out, over a very long period of time. And a historic opportunity for a community that had seen itself, sometimes rightly, sometimes wrongly, as history's eternal victims. Shiites, Iraqi Shiites, are, so to speak, the descendants of, they follow the death of Hussein on the plains of Karbala, the murder of Hussein by an Umayyad army, and they see themselves as having been forever pushed out of political power.
By the murder of Hussein, this is not Saddam Hussein.
Sorry, the murder of Hussein in the 7th century. So for 1,000 odd years, here's a community whose own sense of itself, its own inner identity, is shaped by its victimhood. And this victimhood...
Because the succession to the prophet, the direct line, was murdered by a Sunni oppressor, and this led to the I just
right.
want to fill in the whole.
Yes, absolutely. So think about it. You have never exercised power for generation upon generation, going back about 1,000 years. You have been under this extreme tyrant, a tyrant for whom, even by the standards of the region, is amongst the most grotesque of the tyrants of the region, Saddam Hussein, for 33 years. Your victimization has increased and escalated since all through the 1990s. And along comes, it could have been a man from outer space, and knocks out the tyrants, knocks down the walls of the concentration camp. You now have an opportunity, the like of which history rarely ever gives to anybody. I was born into that community on my father's side, and all through the years of opposition, all through the 1990s, the period of time that Dove was talking about, we knew that the United States, if it would do such a thing, that is what it would be doing. So if that opportunity is wasted, by and large, not because of the mistakes of the United States, that is not to say that the United States didn't make every mistake that it was possible to make and probably invented a few more, but it always wanted to correct those mistakes. The intention, it was necessary for the United States that this be a success story, not the failure that it has turned out to be. And therefore the onus, by far and away, and this is not talked about, which is why I wrote the book. Nobody writes books about, say, most books on the Iraq War talk about the errors of the occupation, the mistakes of the United States. They should never have gone in the first place. Or if they gone in, they should have done this, that, or the other thing. They shouldn't have dismantled the army. They don't talk about what I deem, and what this book tries to show, is the far bigger mistakes made by Iraqis themselves, who were given this historic opportunity and wasted. And the symbol for that is this murder. That, let me just paint it in slightly different, sort of dramatic words. You have the son of one grand Ayatollah who had never left Iraq, and who had, that is Muqtada Sadr, whose father had been murdered by the great tyrant, and the son, Saddam, of course, and the son, and who had never joined an Iraqi opposition, he'd never opposed the tyrant, naturally, because he's inside Iraq, being responsible for the murder of another son of a grand Ayatollah, who was fled and was in opposition, returns. The murder takes place in the holiest city of Jerusalem, and in the holiest site of the city of Jerusalem. That's like a murder taking place not only in Jerusalem, of Najaf, I mean, not only in Jerusalem, but on the Temple Mount itself. And taking place when? On the day of the fall of the great tyrant. This becomes deeply symbolic for me in the novel of everything that went wrong afterwards. I'm sorry I talked out for too long.
No.
But that's exactly why I wrote. I wanted to drive home the failure. Of course, more important than the murder is the cover-up that the very same elite that had been empowered by the American invasion and toppling of Saddam proceeded to do. Why, you say? That's a question to be asked. By covering up everything that they said that they had been for, the rule of law, the democracy, the unification of Iraq, everything that they had said before was rendered meaningless in one fell stroke by covering up this particular murder. So the murder is important in and of itself, but the murder is also deeply symbolic of everything else that goes wrong.
I want to follow up on that, but let me just add one point that I think adds to the symbolism of the murder of the son of one grand Ayatollah and by the son of another senior Ayatollah, a great cleric. Muqtada al-Sadr, his father believed in a hostile relationship to the West and a more activist clerical role, correct?
Absolutely.
Whereas the Grand Ayatollah Hui, the father of the murdered man, had a different philosophy and was at least open to the possibility of a better relationship with the West, which is what the murdered man wanted. Am I?
He was the father of Sayad Majeed, was what's called the quietist current of Shiism. That is the current that believed that religion should have nothing to do with politics. That is, it was a way, of protecting the sect by not engaging in politics, distancing herself. Sadiq al-Sadr, the father of Muqtada al-Sadr, represents the other extreme of Shiism, which became very powerful after the Iranian Revolution, which is the activist wing that believes, no, men of religion have a duty to intervene in politics to direct things in the correct path. So the difference is, once again, a split over two deeply differing theological views of what Shiism is within the Shia world.
Well, as you point out in your book, the exiles who came back and who the Americans helped install in the governing council in Baghdad, they covered up the murder, including the Shiite exiles who came back. The people who came back from outside, whom the Americans relied on, did they have the foggiest understanding of the dynamics of Iraq, including Shiite politics? Because after all, the Americans were sold on the idea that the Shiites would welcome the United States with open arms. And the Americans themselves, including the CIA, which brought Sayad Majeed al-Hui back to Najaf, flew him back in, seemed to have no clue about the dynamics that were going on.
That's true, and that's why in this novel you enter a world that is foreign, or feels foreign, the Shia world, the world of Najaf, of clerics scheming against one another. The common thread of almost everything that happens to almost every character in the novel is betrayal. Everybody betrays everybody else in one shape or another. Of course, being a novel, it's slightly exaggerated. One's allowed a license as a novelist to do that, but it's true of the essence of what went wrong. And deeply, what was fundamentally betrayed by that elite and by the whole governing council, I think, was the idea of Iraq. You see, nobody, here was the United States, ignorantly, but nonetheless well-intentioned. It's setting up a governing council made up of 25 members. 13 Shiites, 4 or 5 Kurds, some Christians, men and women, a kind of a beautifully designed little mosaic supposed to be perfectly representative of, as is humanly possible, of the nature of the nature of Iraqi society. It's not, now the question, the issue is this: who was defending the idea of Iraq as a single entity, as a state, as a nation state? The Shiites were supposed to be the driving force. They had the most to gain by defending that idea, for they had a whole country to gain. And everyone else, you couldn't expect minorities like the Kurds or the Sunnis, who naturally were afraid, defensive. That would be the normal posture of a minority that feels that it is being accused of all the crimes of Saddam Hussein. That is a false accusation, should not be made, but it is nonetheless, of course, one that was made, that the Shiites directed at it. So the Shiites stabbed themselves in the back, so to speak, by subordinating the idea of Iraq to to their own confessional solidity as a community at the expense of Iraq. And so we ended up with a governing council that looked pretty as a picture, but did not even stand for the idea of Iraq. I don't blame the Americans for that. For if you think about it, how else do you go about, if you're going to have a governing council, you have to sort of draw some sort of a picture. Representation seems to be all important. But what's all important in transitions is leadership. And that's where the question of character comes in. It's the character of those men who are able to see beyond the immediate, who are able to say to themselves that having a Sunni prime minister is worth it for the much larger gain. The fact that there are going to be elections, there is going to be a Shia majority, there are going to be parliamentary members, and and to see it in the long run, assuaging the fears of those minorities that legitimately felt afraid, be they Sunnis or be they Kurds, should have been the number one political task of those elite members, of those 13 Shia members, but it wasn't. And that is a failure of character of individuals. It's a failure of politics. It's a failure of vision. It's a sort of, perhaps I'm asking too much. Perhaps you need extremely exceptional men. You need a Nelson Mandela.
Well,
how many countries have a Nelson Mandela?
That's exactly what I was going to ask you. I mean, you were in exile. You, as you said, pursued the politics of hope. Was there ever really a chance that the Shiites coming up from victimhood would not have sought revenge? Was sectarian conflict inevitable in Iraq? And is Iraq basically the role model for the rest of the region?
That's a really important question. And I'd answer it in this way. If you take a concentration camp, and the citizens and the residents of that concentration camp have been in there for 30-odd years, and you knock down the walls of the camp, what are the chances that that community of people coming out of concentration camp would create a better society, as opposed to the kind of society they had lived under inside the concentration camp, full of betrayals, full of lack of hope, full of all of that? Extremely slim. And what is the chances of a country as described by myself, none other than myself, in Republic of Fear and Cruelty and Silence and others? A horrible place, a dictatorship beyond belief. What are the chances that, given that kind of background, one could turn the corner? I agree. Slim, slim indeed. I remember I was once pushed on this by Bill Moyer in a program on the very eve of the war, and he said, give me a number, tell me what the percentage of chance of success. You have this idea that it's possible to make a democratic transition to something better. And I finally didn't know how to answer, but I had to answer. And I said, look, Bill, if there was only a 5% chance of success, of a successful transition to a better polity in Iraq, I would be morally obligated to act on the basis of that 5%, not the 95%. So if you look at my books, they're all 95%, doom and gloom. And what are the chances? But I can't say that. I don't think it's right to say that. Otherwise, we'd always be going with the lowest common denominator. Politics of hope, didn't President Obama himself call his book The Audacity of Hope? So I dare to hope. You have to bet on hope or else you give up altogether. You become a professional cynic, and I couldn't be that.
I can understand how you couldn't be that, but I think we all wrestle with this question, anyone who's concerned about the Middle East. Is it possible to surmount this sectarianism? You know, there was a question that everyone debated for ages before the fall of Saddam, or the overthrow of Saddam, and then before the Arab Spring, which it was, do you need dictators to hold the region together or to hold individual countries together? And of course, here we face that same question again when we have Syria, which has fallen apart, and now we have Donald Trump saying, you know, better Assad. And at the moment, Syria has fallen so far apart, perhaps it's true. There is nothing else but Assad. Or perhaps Assad will just lead to more violence. When you look at the situation in Iraq now, can you see any possibility that this sectarian chaos, in which Muqtada Sadr is still playing a role within, could change? Can you see, for example, if ISIS is driven out of Mosul, a situation in which the Shiite leadership in Baghdad would be willing to entertain a political formula that left a place for Sunnis and made a deal with the Kurds? Or is this just illusory, the politics of hope, the 5%?
If I work on the basis of politics and talk about this little tactic or not, how the battle for Mosul will go, what Abadi is like versus what the forces are, it's a very grim picture indeed. But let's look at the bigger picture. What did I know the war, the American War of 2003 was a huge mistake from an American point of view in retrospect. But what did it do? It left aftershocks which don't appear yet, have not yet appeared in politics. Let me give you an example. Remember, the Egyptian spring, Arab Spring, is deeply connected to the 2005 elections, the first democratic elections that the Egyptians were basically arm-twisted into holding in 2005. A generation of young activists came out, driven also by the internet and by the various groups. There are all sorts of incidents. This has been tracked and shown by social scientists. There is a connection between the 2011 Arab Spring and the fall of Mubarak and the 2005 election. If you think about the Cedar Revolution, 750,000 Lebanese go out and push the Syrian army out of Lebanon. That's big. First Palestinian elections. We don't like the result of the Palestinian elections, but they were real elections. And if we look at the new kind of writing that's appearing in countries, I know Iraq, I only know from this point of view Iraq, new kind of writing. Arab fiction used to be based on bombastic heroics and false and romantic sort of sense of politics, and there was always victims and victimizers. There were very clear polar opposites. Never did the victim become a victimizer and the victimizer become, always the right and wrong, imperialism on one side, Zionism there, and then the rest, and the poor huddling masses back there. That was the structure of fiction, a romantic kind of fiction. We've had that in other places in the world, in other periods of history. Now, there's sarcasm, there's humor, there's coming out by all sorts of writers. There is a sense of our frailty, none of the bombastic. The American War was, you could say it was, let me use analogies which are very dangerous, or pictures. What was the Iraqi state? The Iraqi state, ironically, by the time 2003 came along, for a variety of reasons which we could talk about, would take us away from the subject, was like a house of cards. There was no war to speak of in 2003. There had been a real war in 1991. That was a war, armies fight armies, large numbers of men die, etc. No, this was, somebody pulled the carpet out from under the house of cards and the whole thing comes tumbling down. Then the United States looks around and it has to build a state from scratch. It did not imagine. None of us imagined. I, who made it my business to writing about this state, still was caught up in my own categories of the Republic of Fear that I'd written about, which was describing a 1970s and 1980s Iraq. So this house of cards came tumbling down. And it turns out, even in countries which were not occupied by the United States, did not have a war with the United States, like Libya, like Syria, they too are house of cards. So the problems we're looking at are extremely deep-rooted in this part of the world, and go back to systemic problems with the whole system of Arab states, or at least that portion of it that was born after World War II, the Arab nationalist revolutionary type states that were born after the Egyptian revolution in 1952. And we're looking at something very deep in the region, which may or may not have been triggered by 2003. But so I'm answering this because you asked me for immediate short term, it's very dismal. Next 10 years, grim. My children's children maybe will see something, but under the current, there is something happening.
But the interesting thing to me particularly is, I mean, you said Iraq was the dress rehearsal for what came afterwards. So Iraq was the toppling of the dictator, things fell apart. And then came the Arab Spring, same thing, dictator falls in Egypt. Now we have a return to a dictator. You hear in the region a lot of angst, a lot of bitter recriminations. You hear people saying in different countries, maybe it was better to have a dictator. Anything is better than this chaos. But what strikes me is that Iraq has now been through the ringer, but Iraq does have a constitution.
Yes.
And Iraq does have some history of being a country. People don't recognize that there are links between the south of Iraq and the north of Iraq, tribal links. And so what I'm wondering is, do you think that Iraq has arrived at the point where, again, it could be a dress rehearsal? Is it possible that now the Sunnis want federalism? The Iraqi constitution permits federalism. Before, the Sunnis didn't want it. They wanted to fight for a restoration. So the question now is, are the Shiites ready?
That's a really good question. And the quick answer is, Iraq is in a much better place than, let's say, the other broken states of the Arab world at the moment, for the very reasons that you said. For instance, federalism. Federalism is an accepted category, an integral part of the Iraqi constitution. The fact that it hasn't been implemented yet properly and everybody is still confused about what it means is sort of normal if you think that only 12 years have passed since the idea was invented, so to speak. I mean, we used to talk about it in the opposition all the time. I spoke about it at the Kurdish, in Kurdistan in 1992. The idea was floated around. People thought we were crazy. Now suddenly it's part of the reality. They have to make it work still. The current prime minister is the first decent prime minister, decent in, it seems to be, in many different ways. The problem is he's surrounded by sharks. He's surrounded by massive Iranian influence in internal Iraqi affairs. The militias, the Shia militias, have slipped out of the state's control. But notice what's happening in Mosul. What's happening in Mosul so far, it's the Iraqi army paratroopers, the leftover of the troops that the United States trained, that is doing most of the fighting today in Mosul, that has conquered about 20% of the parts of the city from the east. And there is a deliberate intention, clearly by design of the Iraqi prime minister, that the Iraqi army make its way into Mosul. Let me say here, in the Iraqi case, Mosul is going to be a very important test case, litmus case. Because if they succeed in not doing what they did in the other ISIS-controlled cities, that Shia militias went in there and blew up Sunni homes left, right, and center, and ethnically, essentially, confessionally cleansed cities like Ramadi and like Tikrit. If that doesn't happen in Mosul, if they make, as they seem to be trying to do, if they succeed in pushing off those Iranian-led, essentially, or managed from afar, militias that are now sitting further west, that have been pushed further west and told to guide, be in control of the routes where ISIS will try to escape as it leaves Mosul. If they succeed in that, and if they really succeed in making a model, not of the war itself, which they're certainly going to win, but of the aftermath of the war, then we really have crossed the Rubicon in Iraq.
So just to summarize, because sadly I think we're coming towards the end, and I have one more question I want to ask you, but to summarize, would you say that it is fair to say that maybe there is a slightly bigger than 5% chance now that having gone through hell, Iraq could still provide a role model that would disprove the adage that countries in the Arab world can only thrive under dictatorships, and that might possibly provide a formula that is geographic federalism, which is the only formula that could help put back together countries like Iraq, like Syria, like Libya, if they are ever to be able to regroup and flourish again.
My answer would be, with all the provisos that you put in there, would be yes. But then it's my job to always be their critic. And that's what I will always remain. So I always point out the bad things that they're doing. So the answer is hopefully yes.
And do you think in Iraq today, is there the kind of intellectual discussion that raises these questions? Is it possible in today's Iraq to even talk about the themes? You said your book is being sold so widely.
Yes. It's being sold widely amongst that generation and age that is unfortunately, alas, not being brought into the government. So the government, political elite is separated from the class of young intellectuals who are thinking in this way, and I think that's why they're buying the book and that's why they're discussing the book. So, but they are disconnected from the political class. So alas, the political class is being tested here, and because they are aware that they are failing as well. So the question is, can they turn the corner or not? And on that,
so
I'm
therein
much less.
lies, let us say, 8% hope. Thank you so much.
Thank you.